Hello and welcome to another episode of the Anglican Renaissance podcast. I'm your host, Joe, and today we'll be talking about the kind of big tent element of Anglicanism and how certain theologians fit into this schema. If you're not familiar with the idea of a big tent, the idea is, well, we've got Anglicanism at the center, and then we have how Anglicanism relates to other traditions, some of those being outside of Anglicanism, some of those having versions within Anglicanism that are reconcilable with Anglicanism or have representatives within Anglicanism. Without further ado, and not to waste any time, let's get started. Beginning with the Reformation in England, some of the key theologians that have defined what Anglican theology are, that have provided the strong center that's necessary for dialoguing with other traditions. I think the paramount example of this has to be Richard Hooker. He definitely leans more towards the Protestant end when you get into things like soteriology, but when he's talking about ecclesiology, he expresses a much higher view of the authority of the visible church and the necessity of the visible church. So he definitely provides really the kind of the center point, in my opinion, for Anglicanism. His sacramentology and his soteriology, however, lean towards the Reformed angle, but you can even see if you just read Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, he begins some of the trends even in soteriology that within Anglicanism of differing from especially the direction that the Calvinists and the Reformed will go on the continent and in Scotland. He disagrees, not only obviously advocating for bishops, but he clearly articulates a universal element of the atonement, universal aspect of the atonement, rejects what would become the articulation of the limited atonement in his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. He compares the presence of Christ in the Eucharist to the presence of God in the burning bush and all these other places, his presence in the temple, which I imagine lots of Reformed writers would be very comfortable with, but it's definitely a more kind of locational, objective presence, although he does reject pretty overtly ubiquity. But especially at the time Richard Hooker is writing, there really isn't an Armenian tradition. The Synod of Dort hasn't happened yet. The Reformation, especially as articulated by his predecessor and mentor, John Jewel, in the Anglican world, the hope is that there is some future where the Lutherans and the Reformed, although they disagree now, will be reconciled. You can see in John Jewel's Apology of the Church of England, which, if I had more space in this diagram as it progresses, John Jewel would be right in the center as well, right next to Richard Hooker, in my opinion. You can see him just talking about the Protestant church and the Protestant churches, and he doesn't acknowledge, he acknowledges, but he doesn't side with overtly either side in the Reformation, I guess you could say, and kind of tries to provide a united front in opposition to all the different, I don't know, how would you say, polemics of Roman Catholicism. I would say this early stage is really just about, it emphasizes the differences between Anglicans and Roman Catholics, and it's not until Richard Hooker where you start to get where the Anglican tradition differs with other Protestant groups, and he starts to articulate that pretty clearly in his writings, especially the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. So, in my opinion, he's a very useful theologian to have in the center here. For those people who are looking into things to read, I get a lot of questions like that. A lot of people who are like, "Oh, and what theologians should I read? What books should I read about the Anglican tradition?" Hooker's The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity is probably a really good place to start. Of course, it's huge. So a lot of times what you should do, in my honest recommendation, especially when you're starting out, is find some question that you want answered and just look into that. There are also very helpful republications in more modern language by Davenant Press, especially The Word Made Flesh, which is his part of book 5, which is really does a good job of summarizing Hooker's sacramentology. He lays it out pretty clearly and where he agrees, what he believes and doesn't believe. So in that way, he can be very helpful. But yeah, I wouldn't put him necessarily leaning so in any direction per se, very, very strongly. Although he does believe, I would say, in double predestination, or at least single predestination. You can argue and bicker about which of the differences are those there. But yeah, he's pretty uh, pretty good standard to go by, and reconcilable with a kind of early Reformation Lutheranism, Calvinism being the only representatives. Then you start to get a little bit more development as the Church of England progresses, and I would start to say you see a little bit more of a spread of theologians. Um, you get Ussher, Bishop James Ussher, who is kind of contemporaneous with Richard Hooker and then John Davenant, and he is decidedly very reformed, and a lot of the reformed distinctives he argues for pretty handily, while still consistently arguing for episcopal polity. This becomes the difference for many of the Anglicans who see themselves as reformed, is that the dividing line they would argue between them and the Presbyterians say would be polity, and the fact that we have bishops and three-tiered offices. You also get one of my personal favorite theologians, John Davenant, who, in my opinion, shows some of the ways in which, while many of these Reformed authors consider themselves in the same vein as a lot of the Reformed on the continent, so much so that it's there's a British delegation, and the British delegation gives her opinions, and they're well considered. You do start to see some of the things cropping up. Well, whereas I would say in, say, Presbyterianism and in the Continental Reformation, there is some parties who believe in limited atonement, and some parties who believe in hypothetical universalism. You even get, I would say, decidedly outside of the Reformed tradition, you get kind of Amyraldianism. It's pretty clear to me that if you look at Richard Hooker, you look at James Ussher and John Davenant especially, John Davenant the most clearly of all of them, they don't like the articulation of limited atonement that starts to crop up in lots of other Reformed circles. And they believe, and I think rightly argue, that the 39 Articles do not permit the limited atonement worldview. And so he articulates most clearly hypothetical universalism in his work on the death of Christ. Another thing that Davenant Press has republished, which I think is really good and really helpful, and I would totally recommend. And he has a defense on baptismal regeneration. My hope is to get an audiobook on John Davenant's essay on baptismal regeneration on Anglican Renaissance Library soon, because I do think it's a very good reference point for the Anglican view on baptism that I think helps to bridge the gap, say, between the more Catholic-minded Anglicans and the more Reformed Anglicans. It's this essay, by the way, that Charles Porterfield Krauth, who is a Lutheran American theologian, basically calls John Davenant a crypto Lutheran because of his essay on baptismal regeneration. And in this way, Krauth tends to criticize the Anglican tradition for being too diverse, and says that there are some people he can agree with, and John Davenant is one of those. So I've put him here kind of in between Lutheranism and Calvinism, because he definitely saw himself as a part of the Reformed Church and in dialogue with the Reformed Church, and was actually, I don't think I've ever looked into his doctrine of the Lord's Supper, but I imagine he was pretty Reformed in that. Still, nonetheless, his doctrine of baptismal regeneration and his rejection of the limited atonement view that's articulated in lots of Calvinists really puts him squarely in a reconcilable place, I would say, with Lutheranism. Whereas lots of Lutherans will say, for instance, if you read Franz Pieper, he'll argue that you have to be able to hold sola gratia, which is that we're saved by grace alone, and the idea that God wills all to be saved in tension, and there's a mystery, and they can't be resolved. You have to be able to hold both of those things. I would say John Davenant just accepts that there are two things that are true. He does believe in sola gratia, and very strongly in God's universal will that all men be saved, and his real intent to do so, and the purposes of the atonement in part to be accomplished for all men, accomplished a real payment of debt, or an accumulation of payment that could be applied hypothetically of debt in the atonement. So he really just tries to articulate it. Basically, he just tries to give a scholastic answer for something that Lutherans would say is mostly a mystery. But also you get during this time kind of the rise of Armenians, pseudo-Armenians as well, people who aren't necessarily vocal Armenians like Lancelot Andrewes, but who have been categorized as Armenian-leaning. They have their disagreements with the Reformed tradition, and they find themselves squarely and comfortably in the Anglican tradition, while decidedly pushing towards the Armenian view, although soteriology for these folks isn't as important, I would say, as sacramentology. And in this way, you also start to get the high church, low church divide that will persist for a long time in the history of Anglicanism to this day. But it's not yet as solidified, I would say, as it will become. It's in the later generations where this starts to become more pronounced, in my opinion. So some more characters that I think are worth mentioning. Eventually, you get Archbishop William Laud, who is called an Arminian, and in many ways, soteriologically is Arminian, but his real emphasis is on the high church elements of the Anglican Church. He's a very high sacramentology. He insists on a high reverence in physical things, a kind of ritualism that he supports, and he's a very high church Arminian in that sense, and really establishes very firmly within the Anglican tradition a kind of high churchism. And in that way, he's become popular retroactively with, say, later movements in the Anglican Church, which are sympathetic to, say, Eastern Orthodoxy. Lancelot Andrewes has as well, and I believe that the Western Rite Orthodox press organ is called Lancelot Andrewes Press. So that's why I kind of put them here towards Eastern Orthodoxy. Eastern Orthodoxy and Methodism and those movements, Arminianism, they tend to have a kind of silent respect or silent similarity. They acknowledge that they kind of are on similar pages. I've seen lots of Eastern Orthodox argue that the Methodist movement, especially while it was a kind of Episcopalian, was very like their ecclesiology and sacramentology. However, I would say there are also Arminians and Methodists like John Wesley who aren't as particular about the ecclesiology of, say, William Laud. John Wesley, who is the founder of the Methodist movement, was a lifelong Anglican and a decided Arminian, and in many ways went on to shape the future of Arminianism in a kind of Wesleyan tradition. But he's one of the first Anglicans who I would say decidedly is kind of peeking out of the tradition. So one of the debates of his time was on ordination. So while Methodists and Anglicans agree on the goodness of bishops and the three offices of the church being bishops, priests, and deacons distinctly, Methodists have said consistently that Presbyterian ordination is sufficient. So presbyters can appoint other presbyters, whereas those who disagreed with the Wesleyan movement and the Methodists ended up going more in a direction towards the necessity of episcopal ordination of presbyters. Although the issue has never necessarily been clearly settled, and I would say especially before the Methodist split, there was more ambiguity in the Anglican tradition about what if presbyters could ordain other presbyters ontologically. There was a unanimous understanding that it was illicit or not good or not lawful for presbyters to ordain other presbyters, but whether or not ontologically they would be conferring holy orders or not was a separate question. And I would say, especially in the United States, the Episcopalian Methodist split kind of solidified the camps wherein the Episcopalians have insisted more strongly on episcopal ordination being potentially ontologically necessary. So in that way, I think John Wesley ends up bleeding more into outside of the Anglican tradition towards the Methodist tradition, although he was a lifelong Anglican. One of his contemporaries in the Methodist movement was George Whitefield, who was also a Methodist, but was Calvinistic. And so if I had more room on this, I might move him somewhere near the Calvinist side, I guess you could say. But even George Whitefield, I should point out, never... he's clear. I've looked into this briefly, but he never subscribes to limited atonement, although the language, again, kind of is a development of more modern Reformed theology anyway. But there are certain quotes of his where he explicitly says that Christ died for all men, of all kinds, not just of all kinds, but also all men's sins. Part of this is likely, again, because in the 39 articles there are explicit mentions of the fact that Christ died for all actual sins of men. So how do we reconcile that? What you also start to get is a much higher church ecclesiology at this time, especially amongst the Scottish Episcopalians, who are I would conclude, in the Anglican tradition, and then in what becomes the non-juring schism, which you can look up if you're interested. I might do a video on the non-juring schism sometime later. But a great example of this kind of burgeoning high churchism, which is leaning towards, I would even say, Roman Catholicism, is William Forbes. William Forbes was a theologian who defended prayers for the dead. The Anglican liturgy includes prayers for the dead, and Protestants tend to not like prayers for the dead. He also has, in certain places, defends not just prayers for the dead, but he even says in different places that praying to saints isn't ipso facto bad. He's probably the first, I think, Anglican theologian who clearly says that. I've heard, but have no corroborating evidence, that James Ussher has said similar things about how it's like a vain to pray to saints, but it's not necessarily necromancy because they are alive in heaven, but it's like a dangerous practice, but not always bad. But William Forbes pretty clearly says that the reason that Anglicans don't do it isn't because it's necromancy, but because it's just kind of a weird roundabout, maybe useless accretion. You also start to get at this time, which is again like the late 17th century, early 18th century. I didn't put him on here, but you get conversations between some of the Anglican bishops and Gallican bishops in France. And this is something I've been really interested in lately, looking into. There's a Gallican named Dupin, it's his last name, an archbishop of, I'm forgetting his names, like Le Tellier or something like that, who are French Catholics who don't believe in who think basically the papacy has gone too far. They're more like old Catholics today, and they rejected a lot of the interventions of the papacy into the Church of France at the time. And in fact, actually, there were called the Gallican Articles, which briefly are law in France, where certain rights are denied to the papacy in France. And so there's a rise of this Gallican movement. There's also a rise of what's called Jansenism, which is more soteriological, and not all Gallicans were Jansenists, and not all Jansenists were Gallicans, but some Gallicans were Jansenists and some Jansenists were Gallicans, which was much more amenable to Anglican sensibilities. Jansenism kind of approached Calvinism in some ways, and was very similar to a kind of Protestant soteriology within the Roman Church. And Gallicanism had a much more similar ecclesiology. So you get archbishops like William Wake trying to negotiate with Gallican theologians like Dupin about what a kind of joint Gallican Anglican communion would look like. And it falls apart ultimately because Louis XIV opposes Gallicanism. And if there's no support from the king when you're trying to argue for the rights of the king over the Pope, it's not really going to go anywhere. And lo and behold, the papacy hears about Gallicanism and then condemns it because, why would the Pope ever acknowledge some kind of limit on the Pope's jurisdiction? So Gallicanism eventually starts to die and Jansenism starts to die. But it's interesting to look into what the Anglicans were willing to concede or arrange for in these meetings. You'll find the Anglicans rejected the idea of transubstantiation pretty clearly, while the Gallicans were more okay with it. And the language that they ended up agreeing on, or the proposed language that they could hypothetically have agreed on, was transmutation of the elements. So take what you will with that language. I think that the idea is Gallicans like Dupin and a lot of the Anglicans were really into patristics and going back to the early church and all these things. Dupin has it's called like the New History of the Church that he wrote, which got him in a lot of trouble with the papacy, where he basically admits lots of developments and accretions. And he even argues that these accretions in the Roman Catholic system are bad and wants to get rid of them within the Roman Church. So He's willing to admit that transubstantiation is a kind of accretion. He's willing to admit certain other elements of the papacy are accretions and that they weren't recognized in the early church. So you can see that kind of movement swelling as well, where there's some overlap with people who otherwise would have leaned more towards Roman Catholicism. The interesting element of this is that, of course, Anglicans leaned more towards the Protestants, but the Gallicans, for the most part, leaned more towards Roman Catholicism. And their hope was that they would be allowed to stay kind of in communion vaguely with Roman Catholicism. And it wasn't until, with the Pope, I mean, and it wasn't until they were condemned by the papacy that they were forced to seek other options. Interesting parts of the ecclesiology as well is that Archbishop William Wake was willing to concede to the Gallicans, who wanted to preserve a kind of primus inter pares status in an ideal ecclesiology for the Pope. William Wake, I think Edward Stillingfleet as another man at this time, another theologian, Anglican theologian at this time, were willing to concede, in theory, the Bishop of Rome, at least on canonical grounds, has this kind of primacy, but not infallibility, not a universal immediate jurisdiction, not all these other things. And the Gallicans were willing to concede that as well. So interesting characters all around as well. And so it's not until you start to get into the modern era where you get more the post-Tractarian movement. And the early Tractarians like John Henry Newman and E.B. Pusey, I would say, kind of divide on a line where you get John Henry Newman's famous Tract 90 eventually, where he argues that the 39 Articles can be reconciled completely with Roman Catholicism and the Council of Trent, and then eventually he leaves Roman Catholicism. So in that sense, he is, in my opinion, as a theologian, kind of outside of the Anglican breath. But then, even as he is a Roman Catholic, he kind of has concepts that bleed into Anglicanism. You can find statements from John Henry Newman admitting certain things were accretions in the Roman Catholic system. He will argue that the papacy was a development, just a valid development. He'll also admit that certain Marian devotions do go too far and become idolatry in certain places. So he still, and he holds to a material sufficiency of scripture view rather than there being some separate oral traditions which have been secretly preserved or something in Roman Catholicism. So as opposed to actually, especially even other Anglican converts to Roman Catholicism, like Manning, he has a much more smaller view of the papacy. Even I would say, even though he definitely, I wouldn't argue that he doesn't affirm the papacy, but it's just very interesting. Now, those who stay in the Church of England after the split within the Tractarian movement are often called Puseyites because they're led by E.B. Pusey, who I really admire, and I really like his work as well. My hope is to record some of his works as well for audiobook for the Anglican Renaissance Library, but those are going to come after the Davenant audiobooks. And so he decidedly stays Anglican. He never really does things like recommending prayers to the saints or anything like that. But he has interesting works. One of the ones that I would love to record from him, if it wasn't so long, would be his essay on the Filioque, the history of the Filioque. So in that sense, I can see him kind of leaning towards Eastern Orthodoxy. His opinion in his essay on the Filioque is that the Filioque is true, but that the insertion by the papacy was invalid, and that he would argue that the Eastern Orthodox concern about creating two causes in the Trinity would be bad if true, if that's what the Filioque taught. So they were right to protest that hypothetically, but that isn't what the Filioque teaches. And he was kind of trying to argue, and I think there's some truth to this, that the Eastern theologians never really had this kind of dogmatic opposition to the Filioque until it was wrapped up in the kind of usurpation of jurisdiction by the papacy. And what they really were initially protesting was the papacy and papal jurisdiction that would have, and the idea that the papacy would overrule the authority of general councils or ecumenical councils. And then that evolved into the symbol of that was the imposition of the Filioque. So interesting argument, interesting article. I think in many ways he was actually very good at retrieving historic Christian belief, Anglican belief, and sacramentology as well, which was super important, and which and in ecclesiology as well, which ends up leaning toward Eastern Orthodoxy as well. Um, uh, uh, in the American context, another theologian that I really admire, and I've already released some of the chapters of his dogmatics text, but is Francis J. Hall. Francis J. Hall is definitely associated with Anglo-Catholicism, but I think when you read his dogmatics, oftentimes his project, in my opinion, was to reconcile this growing Anglo-Catholicism with Protestantism, and he really does see at the end of the day the Anglican tradition as representing a solid middle ground and biblical truth from which center point all of the other denominations make errors that make them bleed in one erroneous direction, right? The idea is that all heresies have an equal and opposite problematic heresy, right? So, um, say Eutychianism and Nestorianism, if you understand those Christological errors, right? Those are two equal and opposite heresies, and neither of which being right, because in fact the reconciled position in the middle is actually true. And so the same thing we would say about biblical theology. So the he affirms double imputation of righteousness, and I would say basically the meat and potatoes of sola fide. Although he is careful to use language that he feels both sides would accept. He even talks about merit in regards to our salvation in a way that he tries to articulate so that both Protestants and Roman Catholics would accept it and would be able to explain some of the biblical language about merit and rewards. So in that way, I really like Francis Hall, and I think he ends up being another good center figure like Richard Hooker, although he definitely leans more towards the ecclesialist traditions than Richard Hooker, who tends to lean more towards the Protestant traditions. Another worthwhile figure here is even after the what's called the Goring case, where lots of Anglo-Catholics end up leaving for Rome, like Manning and Newman. You do get lots of very high Anglo-Papalists, even within Anglicanism, who, in my opinion, much the same way that John Wesley leaned kind of out of our tradition by being more low church in some ways, you get figures like Dom Gregory Dix, where I've seen some quotes. I haven't studied on Dom Gregory Dix's theology in excruciating detail, but where he leans really towards the boundaries of Anglicanism, towards say a Roman view on justification and purgatory and prayers to the dead and all those kinds of things, which I would say stray from the safe center of Anglicanism at the very least. So I hope that was an interesting video. It's a thought that I've been having for a little while now, and I thought it would be fun to put it into a little PowerPoint presentation for you guys to kind of show you my thoughts on it. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. Share some of your thoughts. Maybe you have certain theologians who you'd place in certain places on this little graph. I can, if people are interested, I might release on Twitter the blank version of this spectrum so that people can use it to place different theologians on it. That might be fun. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, actually like the video, hit the little thumbs up button, and it'll let me know that you liked the video and you want more content like this. If you have, again, agreements, theologians, want book recommendations, I'll be happy to answer questions in the comments section on this video. Subscribe if you like this video so you can get more videos like this in your inbox. Hit the little bell button and you'll get notified every time I upload a new video. If you want to support me and you want to support what I'm doing here, you can always financially support me over at younganglican.locals.com. Any support is appreciated, and I try to answer any questions from local supporters that I get. You get access to my email, and you get access to a unique community there on Locals where people are asking questions and talking about me. So thank you so much. I mean, this has been an interesting video. Thanks so much for watching, and God bless.